So these are the cards that have been murdered by the return to Naxxramas Mini-Set. Every time we get some new cards, it's fun to take a look back and see the old cards that have been eclipsed by new versions in one way or another. Sometimes that's from a power level standpoint. The new versions just look like they're cheaper or bigger versions of the old cards. And sometimes they're murdered from a design standpoint, where the new designs feel like they just fit a class way better or have some cool extra layer or intricacy that makes the card a lot more fun to play or utilize. So we're gonna have some examples of both in this video, kicking it off with Training Session. This is one of the more straightforward examples for sure in the video. The new Return to Naxxramas Mini-Set card allows you to discover a taunt minion, and then if you play it, you get an extra one. So you can get actually multiple taunt minions in a given turn. If you find enough cheap ones, you can just keep cycling Training Session into more stuff. Whereas with the card I Know a Guy, back from Mean Streets of Gadgets, and this is a pretty old one, you just got a taunt minion. That's all. You just got the one, and if you whiffed on the discover, too bad, you're out of luck. With Training Session, you can take another reroll, try to fill your turn. Basically use this as a single card that fills an entire turn, potentially. I Know a Guy, no such luck. If you get 3 garbage cheap cards, you kind of wasted this, and you're going to be really unhappy with the result. Now, back in the day, we did have things like Taunt Warrior that was a quest deck from Journey to Unguro. So this technically had some synergistic fits. Training Session also technically has some synergies nowadays as well. Filling your hands with taunt cards theoretically does some cool stuff because there are some taunt hand buffs and taunt synergies that way. But as we all know, Warrior hasn't been very good lately and has been pushing a lot of these different taunt and hand buff synergies for really the last 2 years, starting with Barons. And this card did not do enough to get it over the hump. It felt like one kind of big final push for Taunt Warrior, and Warrior right now still isn't there. So for me, I love Training Session. I do feel like this is a great evolution of I Know a Guy, and certainly didn't disrupt things from a power level standpoint. This is still not a powerful card. This is not an example of power creep that has ruined the game or made things like too crazy powerful by any means. But I do like that this gives you backup plans. This gives you opportunities to fill your turn, so you don't feel the disappointment as often from a card like I Know a Guy, where if it does something bad, you feel like you just kind of wasted that card slot in your deck and certainly wasted a little bit of mana up front. Whereas with Training Session, you have more opportunities to make it feel like a nice play. And sometimes avoiding those disappointing moments can make all the difference in a card game being fun or not. So I think Training Session does solve a lot of problems. It tried its best to support this taunt archetype, but it's just not enough. It might have needed some cost discounts or something to make it there from a power level standpoint, but all in all, I think it's just that it's a part of an archetype that isn't quite working right now. So next up here, I think we have a pretty similar example. This is Rake versus Savagery. Now that's an old card all the way back to Classic, and a card that really never got played in this version. There used to be an older version of Savagery that was better, but this version has basically been unplayed for 8 years. Rake, though, murders it here by adding an additional +2 attack. So straight up just a much better version, but also baking in some consistency and some extra utility here with the Savagery, because now you don't have to support it with other cards. It just works on its own, and if you need to use this to remove a 2 health target, then you absolutely can, and then you've got that bonus to attack, which can clean up another small thing or maybe weave in some damage face. And then of course it still scales with any additional attack bonuses as well, so you can still use something like Quest Druid right now, which is still in the game and getting a little tiny bit of play. I've seen some rumors of some Quest Druid decks where you're getting more attack and then Rake becomes more and more useful over time. So it all bundles into a nice little synergy package there and gives itself that little boost, that little extra kick. So if things aren't going perfectly, Rake still just kind of works. And this card's actually getting played a little bit compared to Training Session, which is just awful by the numbers. Rake, as of the last couple days, is up to about 2% of decks. There are some ramp druids actually running Rake, and as I tease, there are some Quest Druid lists kind of floating around as well, which look like maybe tier 3 decks, but nonetheless getting some play. So it's neat that this one change here has actually taken an 8-year-old card and made it sort of close to viable in the modern era of Hearthstone, which of course is a much higher power level overall compared to Classic. And you know what? I think that's totally fine. In fact, I think this is a really good change. Again, it kind of goes back to Training Session. It's nice to know that your card is going to work. And when you play it, something you want to happen is going to happen. Whereas with Savagery, it might often feel like it was just completely dead in hand and it required too much additional support. But with Rake, you know it's going to do at least something, and it feels a lot safer. It feels more consistent. Raising the floor of the card's performance is good because it doesn't feel like you're sitting on that dead card as often. So I actually really like this change. I think if you're going to design cards like Savagery, they probably should have some base level of utility like Rake. So next up for our more straightforward examples, this is one we go back to time and time again. Cannibalize has murdered Assassinate, in particular the old school 5 mana Assassinate. Remember, Assassinate currently exists in the core set at 4 mana, and even that version, which is the buffed version of the original, is now still getting outshined by these newer cards like Cannibalize. Another example of an old one that got murdered here is Blast Crystal Potion. These used to have downsides if they were 4 mana, but now they're 4 mana destroy minion cards with upsides. And we even saw one in this most recent expansion as well for Warlock. Twisted Tether, same thing. This is actually a pretty big upside, I would argue, maybe even a bigger upside than Cannibalize. So what can we say about this that hasn't been said in every single one of these videos in the past where they keep going back to this formula over and over again? I think it's totally fine, right? It's single target removal like this is not worth 4 mana these days. People are cheating out crazy big things so efficiently that 4 mana rarely keeps up, right? And it's fine for these cards to have some additional bonuses and upsides that make it worth it to spend this much mana on a single target removal card. And Cannibalizes is totally fine and fair. Getting a little bit of life back while killing something big, that's a fine exchange for 4 mana these days. I don't think the 4 mana Assassinate, and certainly the old 5 mana Assassinate, just keeps up with what you need in Hearthstone. So again, great examples of taking old designs, evolving them, adding some extra layers of depth and intrigue, making them fit their classes better with something like Cannibalize fits really nicely. And suddenly you have a more interesting card. And Cannibalize is actually getting played in things like Quest Priest decks, despite Priest having some pretty good, really cheap, efficient removal. Like the Light It Burns is often a 1 mana Assassinate in many cases. Cards like Cannibalize are actually still getting played a little bit. Not, again, in like tier 1 decks. Quest Priest is kind of a tier 3 range, but it fits a nice mana spot at 4 for that deck and does actually see some play. So next up here, I think this is a really interesting example. This is Construct Quarter versus Desecrated Graveyard. The Construct Quarter here, of course, the new location for Death Knight, its first location, in fact, and pretty decisively, I'd say the strongest card in the new mini set. Death Knight has taken over on the back of this card. It allows for some just enormous tempo developments early. Destroy a Foul Egg, get a 3/3, and get a 4/5, get corpses for your Death Knight stuff. All in all, just a really perfect synergistic card for what Death Knight is looking to do. Crazy high power level. And we've got Desecrated Graveyard for Warlock back from Alterac Valley. This is one of the objective cards. You'll remember it lasts for 3 turns. In this case, it would destroy your lowest attack minion to summon a 4/4 Shade. Now, there were a couple important distinctions there. It was at the end of your turn. So, you know, unlike the Construct Quarter, you didn't get this awesome 4/5 with Rush to swing the board immediately. So a big delay there. Also, you had a little bit less control over it. You kind of had to build your deck super specifically to hit the right targets, which, you know, might be okay for a card like a Foul Egg, but sometimes that could backfire or be awkward for you if you had things that didn't really want to get destroyed. Now, the Graveyard notably could do this in 3 straight turns where it takes the Construct Quarter alternating turns because of location cooldowns, right? So it takes the Construct Quarter a little bit of extra time to get rolling, but ultimately the same amount of total value. Now, of course, on top of that, the real upsides for the Construct Quarter are the fact that it's controlled, that it's immediate in that given turn, and then you get this big old 4/5 with Rush instead of a 4/4 that's just sitting there hopelessly, and you have full control, so there's no real risk or downside. I would also argue it probably fits Death Knight a little bit better right now. A lot of great Death Rattle cards to utilize this with, and the Corpse Generation is a nice bonus. Warlock has some great lines too with egg stuff in the past, but Desecrated Graveyard never quite reached the synergistic values of something like Construct Quarter. So, you know, I think higher power level, more immediacy, better class fit, all of those made Construct Quarter an absolutely crazy evolution here from Desecrated Graveyard. Also, I would argue locations are kind of the the evolution of objectives. I think objectives were probably some testing grounds a little bit for more permanent style onboard things like Construct Quarter, kind of testing how all that worked and how it would feel, and then they went ahead and launched locations afterwards to develop that idea a little bit further. So I think multiple interesting layers when you compare these two sorts of cards. And frankly, Construct Quarter's too good. This card needs a nerf. This might have pushed things way too far from just how crazy it is. Does this really need to have Rush, for instance? Could it have perhaps been a transform instead of a destroy? I like that it gives you corpses, but still, again, the power levels are off the charts in those regards. So this is an example of taking things a little bit too far in my example, pushing the power level of this sort of design a little too fast, and makes this a really dominant card in the meta right now, and has made Death Knight a real scary standalone sort of tier 1 force in many parts of the meta. So now I want to kind of step back a little bit and maybe go the other direction. This is definitely an example of a murdered card, but man, what a tiny, tiny change. Dark Peddler came out from League of Explorers, right? And Suspicious Peddler, now out in Return to Naxxramas. Number one, it's weird that we got League of Explorers to Naxxramas, so this is like a nostalgia card, but it's referencing a card from a different set. I found that a little bit odd. There's been a few theme fits in this set that didn't make a ton of sense to me, but I'm cool with it, whatever. But anyway, this is a 2/3 now instead of a 2/2. You still get to discover a 1-cost card, but you also have the downside of potentially giving your opponent a copy of the card, which is honestly a really notable downside. You don't want to give your opponent additional resources, especially if they're good cards that you're looking to take. They may not always be a great fit, but a 1-cost card is really easy for opponents often to just kind of slot into their turn and probably prove as a nice little freebie for them. So you get 1 extra health, and you have this really distinctive downside. And frankly, discovering a 1-cost card is not really an amazing effect. There's been a bunch of these 1-mana peddlers in other classes, and those all got like legendary cards or spells or you know, I think specificities that were more useful on average than just 1-cost cards. So we took an old card, Dark Peddler, that was really good in its era. That was a great curve fill for zoo decks and stuff. That worked out really nicely. And you gave it 1 health, and you gave it a downside. And it's like 7 years later or something. I'm probably like 6 years later from League of Explorers, I guess, if I really try to think about the math. I don't know, but in 6 years we traded 1 health for a downside, which that's not really a murder at all. That's actually almost like the old Dark Peddler kind of murdered the Suspicious Peddler. In other words, this has not kept up with the times in the slightest. This card didn't get pushed nearly enough to feel relevant in modern day Hearthstone. Maybe it's like an interesting arena card, I don't know, but in standard format at least, the Suspicious Peddler really has no reason to exist other than a nostalgia vehicle, but a nostalgia vehicle that's not really easy for anybody to play because they have to run such an underpowered card. So this is an example, I think, a little bit of a failure perhaps in the design evolution of this card. Often I focus on upsides and how cards got more intriguing or more useful or just more powerful, and in this case, I technically, arguably more powerful sometimes, but ultimately not any more interesting and definitely not competitive with the modern day standards of Hearthstone. So next up here, we have No Fins Impossible versus Soul of the Forest. And I actually have a lot I want to say about this one. I think this sort of hints at a design trend in Hearthstone I'm not sure I love or is best for the game, but let's get into that. So this is a basic 2-mana version of Soul of the Forest that they both give death rattles. You get 2/2s, right? But this is half the cost, which of course makes it way easier to slot in alongside minions played during the same turn. So, you know, if you're playing Soul of the Forest on turn 4, for instance, you have to have spent the first 3 turns to get your board, and then Soul of the Forest backs up your board with this nice defensive backup plan. If it gets cleared, hey, I still have these bodies to leverage for future damage, Savage Roars, whatever. No Fins Impossible, you can get the same upside of the 2/2s on Death Rattle here, but you can also perhaps play a couple cards alongside it. On turn 4, maybe play a couple 1-drops with it to cement any board you've built from 1 to 3, but also just get some immediate upside as well. And particularly, you know, with some of the Impy Swarm style stuff available in Warlock, you know, for 5 mana, you might be able to summon 4 imps really easily, back them all up with a bunch of 2/2 imp blocks, have a really sticky board for that 5-drop vendor guy follow-up or a Rafam follow-up later. So similar sorts of playstyles to what Druid was looking to do, right? Stabilizing that board and then buffing it up a bunch. And in particular, these have Demon and Murloc synergies, which is in some ways a restriction over Soul of the Forest, of course, because that worked on any kind of minion, and this only works on specifically demons and Murlocs. But for this stage of the game and for what Warlock is playing right now, that's what they like to be running anyway, especially with wide imp boards. So it doesn't really feel like so much of a restriction as it does actually feel like a bonus synergy, because the minions themselves are also demons, which means they can get buffed, they can trigger imp synergies as well. So kind of a restriction, but also just kind of a bonus synergy in this card as well. So the fact that this is half the cost is a really significant upgrade, I think, in function for No Fins Impossible. But that synergy discussion leads us to the conversation I want to have a little bit here, which is that I think a lot of Hearthstone decks are getting more and more narrowly focused into synergistic packages, which lowers the utility of the card in any other setting or environment. For instance, Soul of the Forest can be used across various eras of Hearthstone with any sort of wide board you want. If you had a Beast Druid or a Treant Druid or a Pirate Druid, whatever, just make up some things, right? Soul of the Forest is a card that can always work really nicely in those environments. So you've got yourself a reliable card. It's got some flexibility, etc. No Fins Impossible is a card that's only going to be good specifically when you have wide board Demon or wide board Murloc synergies. And it was designed for this specific part of the meta, and it was pushed in a power level standpoint for this specific kind of package. It's a very narrow and somewhat parasitic design that only functions right now, right here. And I think what that does a lot of the time is close off creativity and options when building decks. Suddenly, it feels like a lot of our decks are preordained or pre-designed by the Hearthstone design team. Like, this is the imp package, and you play all of the imp cards together. And there isn't a lot of flexibility to kind of move cards in and out of that package, because if it's not playing all of the super synergistic stuff, it can't keep up or compete against all of the other classes' super synergistic designs that were all packaged up and built as a deck as well. So you have to walk down these really high synergy game plans in order to be competitive, which I think limits people's ability to play unique and different things, because you kind of have to play all the cards together that were designed together to keep up with your peers. And I feel like as you look at card designs across Hearthstone these days, a vast majority of them fall into these sorts of worlds. And the problems there is, if the package doesn't work, if it isn't competitive, it kind of just kills a lot of your cards. They have no use case for you because they're not in one of the 5 or 6 decks that are working or packages that are competitive, and therefore they kind of just rot on the sidelines and don't feel like cards that are useful to be owned or utilized. So I think a lot of creativity and agency is gone, and kind of value is gone from your collection as well. So I worry about this sort of design evolution. I'm not actually sure it is an evolution in a lot of ways, or for at least large portions of the player base. I wonder and worry if this is sometimes a step backwards a little bit, where I'd rather have lower power, lower synergy cards that have a little bit more flexibility and can be spread out across different decks and archetypes and metas, as opposed to things that are so strict and so narrow in their focus. I'm really curious what you guys think about that. All right, so next up here we have the Ornery Tortoise versus the Knight of the Dead. And these are both 3-cost cards that would deal 5 to your hero on Battle Cry, but Knight of the Dead gets some bonus attack value here up to a 5/5, and it has this really nice mana thirst 7 that restores 5 health to your hero instead. So, of course, as a class card, this is generally going to be expected to be a little bit better. The crazy thing here, though, is I would argue Ornery Tortoise's stats were probably more significantly upgraded in his era than Knight of the Dead's were in its era. In other words, the 3/5 was a bit more premium back then than 5/5 is now. And in fact, Ornery Tortoise got played a little bit in some hunter decks. They liked beasts. They just needed big bodies on board. And Knight of the Dead is currently not getting played even in these pure paladin decks that are happy to deal damage to themselves. It's just not competing with all the divine shields and stickiness of that deck. and in fact just doesn't quite keep up with this modern era despite the additional stat upsides here. So it's kind of funny to think that a 5/5 today is probably less of a stat significance than a 3/5 back in Rosticon's Rumble. That's a shocking sort of change, but stats are just not as valuable or premium as they used to be these days when people can cheat out such crazy big things so early in Hearthstone. But another nice part of Night of the Dead that we should talk about is Mana Thirst, and the fact that this card feels good to play across various stages of the game, which I think is really nice. For instance, with Tortoise, if you top deck that on turn 7, you might not be able to play it. It might literally just kill you because you've gotten so low. But Night of the Dead is a card that even if you get it late, it still has some upside for you. You can still play it. Even an aggro deck, if they're looking for like one final push late in the game, they don't feel restricted in playing Night of the Dead. And I think it's good when cards feel playable. We've kind of talked about that already with a few things where if it doesn't feel like a dead card in hand, that makes the game more fun, makes cards more consistent, and is probably not really a problem for an aggro deck if they grab a little extra 5 health near the end of the game. That's not typically going to be enough to win them the game, but still might feel a little bit better from a player experience, but also gives this card some potential as a dual utility. Maybe a control deck can actually run this as a really cheap, efficient heal late in the game. You never know when you have those options, have that flexibility, new opportunities pop up. And I think Mana Thirst in general is a really cool mechanic to help balance cards. It gives you this extra lever to make things do different things at different times and sort of limit some of their upsides or control the portions of the game in which they're making these kinds of impacts. So I do think Mana Thirst is a pretty neat keyword in that regard. I wonder if this is one that we could see stick around as an extra kind of balancing tool or lever for the team to pull. But ultimately, I just wanted to focus on the fact that a 5/5 these days seems less good than a 3/5 back in the day, and how crazy that kind of feels. So finally here we have another similar comparison to the last, I'd say, a Paladin card versus a neutral card. We've got the Purator versus the Curator. And again, from a nostalgia standpoint, much like the Peddler, we're going back to Karazhan here, not Naxxramas. I don't totally understand the nostalgia on Return to Naxxramas in some of these cases, but ultimately nostalgia is fun either way, and the Purator certainly harkens back to the Curator, both in name and in function and stat here. They're both 4/6 taunts. The Purator is gonna be a mech, we're told, much like the Curator, so stay tuned for that, but currently not. And they both draw you potentially a lot of cards of various minion types, but of course the Purator is gonna give you up to 9 or 10 cards technically, not currently, but theoretically, if there were enough Paladin cards to draw all of those, you could, and often does right now, literally draw you 4 or 5 cards, thanks to some of the dual typed minions we've seen pop up with things like Light Rays and Gold Wings. So drawing 4 or 5, pretty consistent here on a 5 mana card. And the Curator, of course, that had to draw only 3, and you had to spend 7 mana on it. So clearly a much bigger commitment and lower upside than the Purator. Now, the Purator does have a condition, of course. You have to have no neutral cards in your deck, which is a limitation. But again, this kind of brings me back to that conversation we had a little bit earlier about No Fins Impossible, where what this really does is it makes designs on decks more narrow and limits you to a more specific part of your collection, and I think limits your choices more than encourages them. So I guess the way to put this is like the Purator is about exclusion and limiting your choice to Paladin cards. And I know this is kind of a weird example because that's specifically what it's meant to do, but I think generally speaking, as a philosophy, this is something we see repeated time and time again with these really synergistic packages. Whereas the Curator was about expanding your choices. Like, okay, how can I figure out how to put a beast and a dragon and a murloc in this random deck to reward myself with the Curator drawing all of these cards? Because back in the day, that felt like a really nice, efficient card draw card. Would not hold up today. Spending 7 to draw 3 things doesn't quite compete today. But in its era, that felt like a good inclusion sometimes. And you would look for excuses like, okay, cool, let's think, oh, that's a fun beast I could run. Oh, that's a really cool 1 of dragon or 2 of dragon or something I could put in my deck. And you would start to build your deck around these extra ideas and pulling extra things in. Whereas with the Purator, and pure decks, of course, naturally encourage this, you're kind of tossing this out. Okay, I can't use any of my neutral cards. Literally all garbage, right? So you just kind of run down the list of like, okay, these are the Paladin cards that fit and make sense, and then that's your deck and it's pre-built for you. You got to have the Light Rays, you got to have the Gold Wings, you got to have a mech or 2, and it's like, okay, well, the deck kind of built itself in this way. I don't really feel like I'm contributing all that much or really being creative in this case. And I think, again, we see that same kind of philosophy pop up time and time again. And the game is rewarding that by making the Curator, you know, of course, a way more efficient, way more powerful sort of card than the ones in the past. And for everybody else to keep up with that sort of efficiency, guess what? They have to do the same things. They have to play really synergistic packages. They have to walk down the same pre-designed paths where all of these cards fit together really nicely. So you have this arms race of sorts where everybody is just running the most synergistic possible things. And most decks feel like, you know, maybe 20 out of 30 cards are sort of solved for you, and you have less choices, less ways to refine a deck or build something new and unique. So I don't know, maybe I'm harping a little bit too much on this Curator point, but in some ways, I really miss cards like the Curator, I guess. And again, this is definitely a murder from a power level standpoint in total. Clearly, a Curator is a much stronger card. In some ways, it should be as a class card, but still evolved a ton compared to what was a good card back in its day. And I don't know if I totally love that, but I'm definitely curious to hear what you guys think about this one. Was this, in fact, a good change, bad change? Does this kind of design scare you? Do you like it because it makes decks easier to build? Do you like it because you kind of know what to expect? Or do you kind of wish for cards like the Curator? I'm curious to hear those thoughts and more in the comments below. But until then, thanks much as always for watching another edition of Murdered Cards. Hopefully you enjoyed these comparisons. The first person who says it's not fair to compare a class card and a neutral card, I will mock you openly in the comments, because there's no such thing as fairness. These cards don't care. It's absolutely fair. And in fact, that's often a very interesting point of comparison, how class cards can do different things and open up different opportunities than neutral cards. So I would say stop limiting yourself by silly rules. There is no universal truth to uphold here. We are merely having fun comparing these cards, and cross classes is the exact same argument. Why does this work better in one class than another? That's a great fun comparison. So stop being stupid and contradictory. It doesn't make you look smart, it makes you look annoying. That said, thanks for not being annoying everybody else. Thanks for watching, and until next time, game on.